So I was raised in Raleigh, North Carolina. My father was a huge history buff and, from New York City. And so we would often travel between North Carolina and New York City to see family growing up. And on those trips, we would stop at different Civil War sites, also Revolutionary War sites, but Civil War sites always were a little bit um, more impactful and a lot more gravity to me. And, this idea of, I grew up in the 90s. So America maybe was at the peak of its power in the 90s, it culturally, but also maybe politically. And so this idea that, the United States had splintered, had fractured in two and fought itself was so foreign and so wild of an idea for my, child's mind to comprehend that I just kind of like formed this like innate, intense fascination with this time period, with the war and with the two sides, with the North and the South, the Union and the Confederacy. And so that basically kicked off this like intense passion as a kid, reading a lot, visiting a lot of sites in North Carolina and Virginia, along the way up north. Um, well, it was later my parents divorced, and I started to get this other kind of side of the Civil War, of a different perspective in it. My mom remarried a black man, and I was raised with a stepbrother, Cameron, and we went to a Civil War site in North Carolina. I believe it was Averisboro out east past Raleigh for a reenactment. And the story was such that my brother, they had a little like souvenirs shop set up, where they had like little caps and maybe toy guns and like some flags from like Union regiments and Confederate regiments and things like this kind of thing. And my brother, 3 years younger than I am at the time, so I was probably maybe 9 or 10, so he was probably 7 or 6, and he really had a huge fascination with just the visual design of the Confederate flag. So, young black boy, really interested in the design of the Confederate flag. He at the time didn't understand any contextual information around what the Confederacy was. He was just drawn to the graphic design of it, essentially. Um, my mother, God bless her, she grew up in a Catholic family in Chicago, Catholic school. I question how much she really knew at the time about the Civil War, and a lot of, I'm sure she knew about slavery, but I'm not exactly, in terms of like, what the war was fought over, if she knew all these details. My mother bought my stepbrother that Confederate flag. And so imagine, right, like my stepfather's reaction to my stepbrother having been purchased this from his, maybe wife of a year or two, right? So that kind of set off a bit of a fracture inside the household. So at first glance, I saw the kind of charged emotion that can come from just a symbol that is stemmed from this war, right? That became charged and has been charged in our nation ever since. So it's just a microcosm of that struggle, of that frustration, of those, um, you know, the, let's call it like the baggage that we all take, right? The unresolved frustrations and emotions that come from the Civil War. And it was, placed right at my doorstep. And so, the ride back home was about an hour or so, and it was a tense ride back home, right? And so you can imagine the kind of arguments that took place, like you should have known better, all this kind of thing that happened. And so that left a huge lasting impression on me in terms of like, what is it that we kind of all bring to our outlook, our identity? What do we bring to our relation to the Civil War, and how does that inform who we are today and our relation with each other? And so this is kind of my, let's call it like early entry point into thinking about the Civil War, but then also, the basis for my interest that goes on later to basically catapult me into making this work. There's this kind of baggage or this kind of like emotional weight that we bring with ourselves to these landscapes. And so, if you studied and you learned about the kinds of deaths and kind of carnage that happen in these spaces, you already, I think, are entering these spaces with a certain type of reverence, in terms of just like an honor for the pain and suffering that happen in these spaces, baseline, pure. And so, out of respect for that, I think there's this sort of like respect coming into these spaces. But then once you arrive in these spaces and you see, I think it like there's like this another kind of it's kind of this surreal moment where your like readings and your studying of the war has kind of like synced up with like the embodied space itself. You've read about it on the pages in the history book, and now you're in the space where 30,000 men died in an afternoon, if we're talking about close to, right, if we're talking about Antietam. And just to think about that kind of number and that kind of like mass death is, something that as like, a modern contemporary American can't fathom. And then also when you kind of parse it out and think about how it was us fighting our family members, us fighting our cousins, our brothers, our fathers, it just kind of like creates this almost like, at one time, like unbelievable, like situation. Like it's almost impossible to believe it's even true. There's like this almost kind of like, that's why I call it surreal, because it's so almost like, fiction in a way, but we know it happened, right? We were still struggling with the fallout from it today. And so being in these spaces, I have this amazing, respect for what happened, but also like, they're very haunting spaces when you go there. There is sometimes eerie. A lot of these spaces today are, used as recreation spaces of sorts. Like people come and they'll walk around, take their dogs for a walk or go for a jog and things like this. And it's really interesting because, in a way, this kind of relaxation and this kind of like recreation pastime kind of belies the nature of these spaces. So it's really kind of strange where you have these people who are, getting their steps in and running a lot and enjoying their times in a space where, thousands of men died in the course of an hour or something like this. It just kind of is the complexity of that space. And when you walk into these spaces holding that all in at one time and kind of trying to entertain that, it's very complex. But it's also just, it's very haunting. So I'm just kind of like, aware of all those things at one time. Yeah. So I started making this work in 2019, and this is before I went to grad school. And so I think I was making the work before it even became obvious to me that this was going to be a long-term project. I think I was just going to these spaces and making photographs because I was interested in going to these spaces and making photographs, not because I was interested in going to these spaces to tell some kind of large story later on. I was just like, I'm purely interested in what these spaces look like on film. So, it became a way to kind of, um, exercise my photographic eye in some ways. And it wasn't until I think, going to grad school and thinking about telling stories, it became such an important kind of like, um, you know, goal of mine to be like, well, there's actually something very important here, right? For a while, I didn't know, I didn't want the series to just be landscapes. There's more to our story as Americans than the landscapes of the Civil War battlefield. And I was actually, it wasn't originally my idea, but I was talking to my brother-in-law who was talking about, he just kind of nonchalant said, "Oh, so you've been going to these battle sites and what, taking photographs of visitors?" And I was like, I actually have not been taking photographs of visitors, but that's actually like, just kind of like being open to the idea and like at this point, like I wasn't, very interested in portraits of people. It wasn't something I was doing often, but it struck me immediately as the thing I needed to do to tell the story, the thing that was, in some way I didn't know that was even missing, but was. Um, who are we in light of this national rupture? And how is that shown on our faces? And how do we remember that? What does that look like in our time there when we embody this space? And that could be a lot of different things. I mean, like, I think, like, in a lot of ways, going there and making a photograph of someone who's even there for recreation um, is not a failure in that. That's a part of the story, right? Necessarily. That's why they're there. It's maybe not necessarily tied to, um, an individual memory of it, but this is how the space has become to be used and speaks to how we relate to it. Of course, that's not everyone. There are people who are there who are, looking up ancestors who are there looking to find out where their grandfather fought on the line, right? Or their great grandfather or whatever fought on the line. So, in a way, it has my relation to the project and how I've gone about directing it has really, worked itself out and has shaped itself over time through me listening to what other other people are thinking about the work and how they respond to it and what their interests are. I guess, like, in a way, my brother-in-law talking about, well, you're taking images of visitors. That's something that was obvious to him, not to myself, because I think, like, entering into this space, I was more of a landscape photographer, right? I was really interested in new topographic work and things like this. And so, what did this kind of, like, built environment of like a recreated land battlefield look like, right? With all these snake fences and things like that. But hearing about, why, well, you should be taking photographs of visitors, I was like, that makes a lot of sense. What does that look like? Who are these people? That seems a lot more, dynamic and a lot deeper than just images of the landscape. The first one it's actually a photograph that I believe is in the show. It's with, I believe it's Rodney, Robin, and Kennedy. It's a family in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And if you look at that photograph, the parents are very kind of like rigid standing, right? It kind of underlines, you could maybe think they were like, military members, and they are, right? That's who they are, which is really interesting that that's even shown. So, that likeness in the photograph, that they're standing that way. So Rodney, I was speaking with, and the father, and they lived just a little while away, maybe 5 minutes, and were there walking around. He knew the history of everything that had happened in that space, and it was interesting because, like, we kind of hit it off immediately, just because in terms of, like, our interest and the kind of what I described as this, like, intense gravity that we feel. It was something that he had kind of mulled over a lot himself. We both had kind of, you know, shared this idea of the gravity of the deaths that took place in that space, like the hollowed ground kind of feel to it, the kind of, like, maybe even and this is maybe a little bit of conjecture coming from my place, but maybe he was kind of thinking in terms of, like, service to one's country, right? This sense of duty and honor that was elicited in that space from those men who died in those fields. So just kind of like, in a way of sharing a certain emotion, certain outlook, that was very strong in that instance. There was this other time period, and this was in not a battlefield necessarily. It was in Danville, Virginia, which, after the Richmond fire, at the end of the war, when the Confederate cabinet was retreating south, Danville was called the last Confederate capital, because it's the last time that Jefferson Davis meets with his council, his cabinet, and they decide to dissolve the Confederacy, essentially. But anyways, it's on this property just downtown Danville. And at the time I was walking up, there was a protest that was happening. There were two sides. There was, anti and for. And the thing that they were protesting was uh, that space, that property now has been used as a museum for art and history. And they had originally flown a Confederate battle flag. And it was only recently that they decided to remove that battle flag. Um, and the community was upset about it. People were, supporting it, and other people were there to protest the people who were supporting it. So what I found interesting was going between the two camps is that there was a lot more vitriol from the side that was protesting the Confederate side. They had a lot more ire. They were because I was photographing both sides. They insulted me because I was photographing the Confederates, which I thought was kind of rich. So that was interesting to me. But also, what's even more interesting to me was when I was talking to the Confederate side, and I was photographing them. I took this photograph, and I don't believe I showed it to you or is in the show, but it's this photograph of a 8-year-old boy. And he's got this, he's holding this long Confederate, flag on a staff. And, the way his eyes, he's very kind of resigned, but resolute, very kind of you can tell he's sure of what he believes right now. But what I thought was very, striking meeting this, and it wasn't a conversation that I had with him, but it was a feeling of something that I saw in his eyes. It was just very clear to me. It became I was hyper aware of how, I call it this emotional baggage. We can, or our certain alliances and everything like that. It was very clear to me that oftentimes, and this is something I've known and have had experience with in the past, but it was just so painfully clear to me that we often don't get to decide what we believe, right? It's kind of inherited what we believe. And so this photograph of this young boy, 8 years old, sitting there with this Confederate flag, he was with his grandma and everything like this. She was the one who said it'd be fine if I take a photo and everything. It became so clear to me how, our allegiances, our opinions are essentially in many times are just inherited, right? And let's say the beauty or even the tragedy behind that was so painfully clear to me. I think it goes right back to this kind of um familial inheritance of these things. It's so charged with home and with conceptions of identity. And so, I think one of the ways I like to say this or answer this question is it's so, it's quite difficult to tell the color of the house from the inside. You can't look out and see the color of the house from the inside. And so, I think it's that same thing with self and identity is we have this idea of who we are. We were comfortable in ourselves, but we always miss the earnest, honest criticisms about ourselves that are true, that are glaring, that are right in front of our faces. We just can't see them because we're looking from the inside. And so I think in terms of you could talk about it in terms of you know notions of privileged Northerners or notions of bigoted Southerners and things like this. Of course, they're caricatures and stereotypes, but the fact of the matter is that although it's not true in all cases, those things come from a place, a kernel of truth. And I think like it, even though it's difficult to be honest with ourselves about who we are, that is like the charge, of a responsible individual. And so, but it becomes tricky. And then it also becomes, it's not just a matter of individual, there's also like politicians involved, right? And that gets really tricky when, it's someone's job to get you riled up about who you are and where you come from. They're really good at doing that. So, I think a lot of times we're really fighting against strong forces when we're trying to battle and think about what's true to ourselves and reflecting on that to then, address those issues in our lifetime, or address those issues in terms of, um, the gamut of American history, but also how we relate to that history and how that informs who we are and who we are to each other on a regular basis. It's interesting. My perspective on, let's say, for example, patriotism has really shifted. I would say in the last 10 or so years. I grew up in, the Bush era, the second Bush era, right? And so post 9/11, I thinking about like all the flag waving that was going on and like just what the kind of like requisite actions that you need to be a patriot, quote unquote, right? I think about you know John Prine's song, "The flag decal on your truck's not going to get you into heaven anymore." As if like all you need to do is be a patriot to get into heaven and things like that. Um, you know, sure. I mean, like, I'm not gonna like deny that a love for country and like a proudness of our country is not an aspect of patriotism, but patriotism is so deep and dynamic that it can't just be one iteration. It can't just be one avenue of action. That's precisely the criticism that's been leveled against it. And that's why these notions and these images and evocations of patriotism are shallow and hollow, right? And why they're made fun of so much is because it's not just that. So like, but as a young kid growing up in the Bush era, that was shown to me as patriotism. I was like, okay, that's patriotism. But then, growing up and, learning more and dealing with more tricky, complex, nuanced ideas and stuff like that, I begin to like own a certain kind of understanding of what I think patriotism is or what it ought to be as well. And so, while I acknowledge a certain kind of like love for one's country, but kind of trying to, have a healthy relationship and distance with like a certain nationalism, I think a certain kind of uh, like interrogation of our history that comes from a certain like love of being here, of the land, of the history. And again, like going back to your question about, being honest with ourselves and, earnest and not, cloudy eyed about our identities is through examining this history and through rigorously critiquing it, we arrive at what it means to be actually in love with something, right? What a love is. And that is patriotism, I think, is like at the bottom of it is how your love is reflected of your country. And if you love it blindly, there's an issue. If you love anything blindly, there's an issue. Um, it's all about how we examine things. And it's that examination, and you can love things, in spite of their shortcomings. That's what makes a love more full and more, I think, like, vibrant and complete. Because isn't that just how we love people who we love in our lives? They're not perfect, and isn't that even like if I want to I think even bring the analogy even further a bit and relate it to like a certain kind of like Christianity, is like this world in which we're living in is, not perfect, but it is the manifestation of, divinity. And so it's like, that really tests who we are and shows, bringing it back to patriotism. Like, yes, there's all these things wrong with our country, but we love it so much that we're going to like point out what's wrong and then work to make it better, right? Instead of just kind of blindly waving the flag and be like, you know, America's amazing and light off a bunch of fireworks and drink 6 pack of beer, whatever. Like that's great and all, but it's more than that. And I think that's what's I think sometimes missing. It has been missing for many decades in the political spectrum. And, I'd like to see, and that's what I think like one hopes of my, for the work is that people will stop and kind of reflect a little bit deeper on, who we are in light of this war, right? And not just, say this was good, this was bad, but like really kind of like get a little bit more deeper at the complexities of the issues involved in who we are. Nothing in particular, like I want them to receive a certain message or anything like that. But what I'm interested is I hope that the work gives them pause to reflect on their own, relation to the war and how they think about America and how they also think about America with where we are today. The work is not a complete analog to exactly what's happening in the nation today, but there is a certain kind of parallel between the Civil War period in the 1860s and what's happening today in terms of how divided we are on political lines. There is a much larger influx in political violence in this period in which we are in now than there has ever been probably since the Civil War. And so, I don't think it's tenuous to draw these lines and parallels. So I would really hope that, that gives your audience or our audience pause to think about, how does this connect to my daily life? How does this connect to our political life as Americans? And what can I take away from that in my own reflections? So in base, my hope is that people will sit with the work and really consider it in light of everything that's going on in their daily lives and in their political lives.